At the company party, my wife's ex-husband took her from me and said she belonged to him, while pulling her by the arm as if I were just a disposable phase in her life. The entire hall fell silent when he shouted, with that victorious smile on his face, as if he was reclaiming a lost trophy. And she, motionless, without looking at me, without reacting. It was at that moment that my blood ran cold, my throat went dry and the words that came out of my mouth made the entire room stop. People knocking over glasses, others looking at each other, some laughing nervously, others holding their breath. And I stood there, sweating under my jacket, trying to understand how everything had gotten to this point, how a story that began with candlelit dinners, spontaneous trips and promises of eternity turned into a public spectacle of betrayal. No, it hadn't started there. That was just the climax of something much older, more rotten, more cowardly. For months, maybe even years, she pretended. He pretended love, desire, complicity. He pretended he chose me every morning. And me? I was blind, needy, too busy trying to build a comfortable life for both of us. I thought little silences, mechanical touches and empty apologies were part of the routine of a mature marriage. But deep down, something inside me screamed for attention. I screamed for a look that no longer came, for a hand that no longer held mine, for a body that no longer sought me. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, it was silent, it was constant. It started with the disregard for details, the monosyllabic answers, the lack of sparkle in the eyes. And it culminated there, in front of co-workers, friends and strangers, with that man, that damned man, ripping off the mask of our charade. He didn't appear out of nowhere. He came back. Like a shadow of the past, a mistake that should never have been corrected. They had a history, a short and troubled marriage, and according to her, they had overcome it. But he wasn't over it. It was there the whole time, orbiting our lives like an invisible threat. She said it was just an old chapter, that today they were just friends. I believed. Because loving, sometimes, is being stupid. And I went. I accepted the messages, the casual meetings, the calls at strange times. I accepted because I wanted to keep the peace, because I thought jealousy was something for insecure people. Until the day he showed up at our company. Hired by a strategic partner, smiling like someone who knows too much, greeting everyone as if they were already part of it. I should have already realized at that moment that the game was rigged. Over the next few weeks, he grew closer to her as if he had never left her. I saw it. I felt. Their every laugh, every look exchanged in the pantry, every unintentional touch. And she became someone else. More alive. Lighter. As if I were the burden and he was the relief. I tried to talk, I tried to win back, I tried to be better. I prepared surprises, changed habits, tried like a desperate man trying to save an already sunken ship. And all I got was coldness. Distance. Empty. I already knew. Every betrayed man feels it. The body speaks before the fact happens. Betrayal begins within us, like a feeling that bites inside. But knowing and seeing are different pains. Knowing hurts, seeing destroys. And seeing my wife in her ex-husband's arms, at that party, in front of everyone, was cruel confirmation that I was never enough. Not for a second. When he said, "She belongs to me," I saw a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't fear, nor discomfort. It was desire. And it killed me. I wasn't just betrayed as a husband. I was betrayed as a man, as a partner, as a friend. And there, in front of everyone, I knew that that scene needed a worthy ending. It was then that I said what needed to be said. Not a scandal, not an emotional appeal, but a sentence. A truth that no one expected to hear. Because at that moment, between the silence and the judging looks, between the pointed fingers and the hands that covered shocked mouths, I needed one thing, justice. And she would come. Because what no one knew at that party was that I already knew everything. I was prepared. Not to beg, not to fight for someone who dismissed me as a stranger, but to turn the tables. And what I revealed there was just the beginning of the end for her and for him. The party, which was a celebration, turned into a court. And I had the evidence, the names, the papers. He, the man who said she was his, didn't know that that same day, in the morning, I had bought 40% of the company where he worked. And the first official action as a new partner was to send a formal resignation request. Not for cheap revenge, but for dignity. Not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. And she, well, she lost much more than a position or a title. You lost the right to pretend. Because the secrets she hid weren't just in the deleted messages, they were in the everyday lies, in the half-truths that served as anesthesia for the guilt. And one by one, I revealed every detail. Every farce. And what began as a love triangle unfolded into a web of betrayals, manipulations and barely disguised ambitions. Because she didn't just betray me. She betrayed our history, our friends, our company. And at that party, everyone discovered that she wasn't who she pretended to be. But the most surprising thing of all was not the revelation. That's what happened next. When she thought she could come back, that an apology was enough, that the tears in her eyes would solve everything. But tears don't wash away lies. And it was there, when she tried to justify herself, that I realized, the love I felt for her had died. Not in an act of hate, but in an instant of clarity. Sometimes the worst betrayal is not the physical one, but the emotional one. It's when the person you love doesn't choose you anymore, even though they're by your side every day. It's when she shares her soul with another, and offers you only her body. I didn't want revenge, I wanted peace. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully. Because betrayals hurt, but they also free. They tear away the veil of illusion and show us who is really by our side. Now, she lives the consequences of her choices. And he, well, he still doesn't understand what he lost. Because there are things that pride cannot fix. And me? I rebuilt my life. Not to show that I won, but because I deserve to be happy. I found someone. Someone who looks at me as if I were enough. And that alone is worth all the hell I went through. But what happened at that party, that sentence I said, that revelation, that twist that no one saw coming, still echoes in the heads of everyone who was there. Because it was there that the tables turned, that the masks fell and that the truth, naked, raw and cruel, came to light. And the most curious thing is that all of this started long before the party. It started with a question that still haunts me to this day: at what point, exactly, did she stop loving me? And maybe the answer lies where it all began, or where it all ended. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support no kind of betrayal, on the contrary, we expose its consequences. All stories are fiction, but they carry a brutal truth: betrayal destroys homes, families and souls. Get ready to immerse yourself in a narrative intense, emotional and unforgettable. Now take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear is shocking. Ethan and Clara met at a digital marketing conference 8 years ago, when they were both at very different stages in life, but equally open to the unlikely. He, a discreet and perfectionist data analyst, known among his colleagues for his professional rigor and a certain elegant shyness; she, a sunny and persuasive communications manager, with a laugh that filled rooms and a curious look that always seemed to search for some hidden truth in people's gestures. It wasn't love at first sight, it was something denser, rarer. A feeling of fit between two worlds that, at first glance, seemed opposite, but in practice became complementary. She would make him go out of control, and he would make her stop to breathe. Within a few months they were living together. 2 years later, they walked down the aisle in an intimate ceremony by a lake, with few friends and many sincere smiles. It was beautiful. It was real. At least, it seemed like it. Their marriage was, in everyone's eyes, a portrait of modern stability: two successful professionals, a minimalist-style house in the city's upscale suburbs, a dog named Kiko who became the neighborhood's favorite, well-planned annual trips and home-cooked dinners with jazz playlists and glasses of red wine. Clara was spontaneous, spoke with her eyes and got angry easily, but she knew how to apologize with disarming tenderness. Ethan was methodical, controlled the couple's finances, was an excellent listener and rarely raised his voice. They had arguments, like everyone else. But they resolved it. Or they put it off well enough to seem like they resolved it. They shared Sundays with series on the sofa, Saturdays with visits to Clara's parents and nights with long conversations about work. Their relationship was built on a solid foundation of complicity, or at least the appearance of it. They had rituals, dinners on Fridays, morning walks on Sundays, notes hidden in drawers with phrases like, "I love you even when you irritate me," or, "Come back soon, your absence makes noise." It was a relationship that caused silent envy in some friends and loud admiration in others. Ethan, although reserved, was intensely passionate. He kept clippings of moments with Clara in small folders on the computer, he remembered dates with almost frightening precision, he prepared surprises even on ordinary days. For him, love was in the details, a coffee left on the table with a good morning post-it, the care to buy her favorite wine without her asking, the patience to hear about a conflict at work even after an exhausting day. Clara, on the other hand, was intense. "I would like to live in the now in a hurry." She fell in love with Ethan's ideas, but sometimes she grew tired of the predictable rhythm he imposed on life. "I needed adrenaline, novelty, challenge." And slowly, that restless temperament began to find friction with the comfortable stability that Ethan prized. He liked to make plans. She liked to break them every now and then. In the early years, this difference was fuel. It made them complete each other in a curious, almost fun way. But, over time, they became sparks that burned in long silences or short absences. They weren't fights. They were spacings. Intervals between looks. Clara started to hang out more with coworkers. I returned late from external meetings. Ethan, in turn, delved even deeper into his reports, spreadsheets, and new projects. Not out of indifference, but perhaps because she didn't know how to deal with her new behavior. And, deep down, he feared suffocating her with questions. He was the kind of man who preferred to understand rather than pressure. He believed that trust was something that was offered whole, not in installments. So when she said she needed space, he opened the door. When she said she wanted to go out with her colleagues, he responded with a sincere, "Have fun," even though something in his stomach clenched silently. Clara's work began to gain more prominence. She began to be invited to important events, lectures and corporate meetings. She was admired, sought after, celebrated. And that, in a way, invigorated her. "I always came back from these events with shining eyes, full of stories to tell." Ethan listened attentively, with pride, but also with a pang that was difficult to define. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. Fear of being left behind in the life of that woman who seemed increasingly unreachable, more luminous. Still, he supported her. He clapped, took photos, made a point of being in the audience when she went on stage. He made a point of reminding her, every day, how much he believed in her talent. But something started to change. Clara started putting on more makeup for work. Choosing clothes more carefully. Hiding the cell phone when he approached. Smiling less at him on Monday mornings. Kisses became airborne, hugs were quicker, touches were more formal. There was still affection, yes. But a warm affection, without hunger, without urgency. Ethan noticed, of course. But he pretended not to notice. Because sometimes, loving is also knowing how to silence fear. And he was afraid. Fear of confrontation and loss. Afraid of putting pressure on her and making her move away for good. So, he was silent. He remained silent while she changed her perfume, while she began to respond to messages more slowly, while she said everything was fine with that rehearsed smile on her lips. He was silent, but watched. The company party where Clara worked would be the biggest event of the year. The celebration of the results of a successful merger, the chance to show the new partners the strength of the team that built it all. She was euphoric, involved in every detail, from choosing the buffet to the type of lighting in the room. He spent weeks talking about it with genuine enthusiasm, as if that night was more than an event, it was a milestone. And Ethan, even though he knew he would be surrounded by strangers, agreed to go. He bought a new suit, cut his hair, tried out smiles in the mirror. I wanted to measure up to her. He wanted to be, for one night, part of that world that she lived so intensely and from which he felt increasingly distant. On the night of the event, the room was immaculate. Amber lights reflecting off the tall windows, elegantly decorated tables, tasteful background music and a crowd of well-dressed faces. Clara seemed part of that scene, as if she had always belonged to it. It was stunning. The tight red dress highlighted her silhouette and confidence. Ethan looked at her with admiration, but also with a hint of strangeness. As if she were there, but also somewhere else. As she walked around the room, being greeted by colleagues and superiors, he tried to fit in, but it was clear that this was not his territory. He felt out of place, like an extra in a film in which Clara was the protagonist. Still, when she called him with a subtle gesture or when she introduced him as, "my husband, Ethan," he smiled. He smiled because he still believed. Because I still wanted to believe. She, in turn, seemed more distant as the night progressed. He answered calls in the corner of the room, came back looking distracted, and every time he tried to hold her hand under the table, she gently removed it. Ethan tried to understand. He tried to convince himself that it was just the stress of the organization, the formality of the environment, the pressure of the event. But inside him, something writhed. In the weeks leading up to the party, Ethan had been noticing subtle movements. Small emotional absences. Clara was more critical, less present. He would arrive home from work and find the house dark, the food ready, but she was locked in the office. She said she was immersed in reports. And he respected it. Always respected. But the doubt grew in silence. A doubt that was not fed by evidence, but by perceptions. And in that room, between toasts and laughter, he realized that the abyss between them was no longer invisible. It was there. Sample. Between glasses of champagne and handshakes, there was a silence between the two that no music could cover. That night, something would move. Something would get out of control. But he still didn't know. I still believed that maybe, with a conversation at the end of the party, they could rescue what seemed lost. I still thought that maybe Clara was just tired, or confused, or overwhelmed. He didn't yet know that the truth wasn't a shadow deep in her eyes, it was a silent scream that was about to explode. And as he smiled at her coworkers, as he praised the table arrangements, as he told her he was honored to be there, a silent storm was brewing. A storm that would soon turn their world upside down. During the days leading up to the party, Clara was restless. She said it was nervousness due to the responsibility of the event, the weight of representing her team in front of new investors, but her absences were longer, her responses more automatic, and her eyes often wandered to places where Ethan couldn't reach. When he arrived home and found her distracted, sitting on the porch with her laptop on her legs, she would quickly close the screen as if she had been caught in something intimate, but said she was just adjusting the last details of the presentation. Ethan observed in silence, respected the spaces, but inside him anxiety began to scratch the walls of his chest. He wanted to believe that everything was just the result of a troubled period, he wanted to believe that she still loved him as she said, he wanted to trust as she always did, but something in her breathing at night, in the tone of voice with which she called him, in the way she avoided looking him in the eyes when she talked about work, made him doubt what was previously unquestionable. The party was as she predicted, elegant, grand, crowded. The tables were impeccably arranged, the spotlights pointed towards the central stage, the guests excited about the company's new phase. Clara circulated among them like a confident hostess, with absolute control over matters, charming investors and colleagues with her ease. Ethan watched her from afar, feeling pride and, at the same time, a painful distance. It was as if he had been invited to watch a movie he was no longer a part of. She smiled a lot, but not at him. The look she exchanged with some people, especially with a tall man with a well-groomed beard and a provocative look, seemed to contain messages that Ethan couldn't decipher. Tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination being fueled by insecurity. But he couldn't look away. Every time he saw that man approach her, pull out a chair for her to sit down, or touch her on the shoulder while making a comment, an uncomfortable pang grew inside him like a seed of something he didn't want to name. During dinner, Clara spent most of the time engaged in conversations that Ethan could barely follow. His colleagues laughed at inside jokes, talked about projects he didn't know about, exchanged references naturally, and he felt even more out of place. At one point, she got up to speak at the microphone and thanked everyone for being there, talking about the team's effort, about the new phase that was beginning and about how important it was to maintain the values that have always guided the company. In the middle of speaking, his eyes met Ethan's for a brief second. It was fast. Almost imperceptible. But enough so that he felt empty. There was no shine there. There was a kind of suppressed guilt, a well-trained disguise. And in that instant, he knew. I didn't know how, but I knew. Something between them had been broken, even if neither of them yet had the courage to name it. Throughout the night, Ethan tried to get closer. I wanted to dance with Clara, but she refused, saying she was tired. He offered to walk her to the balcony to get some air, but she said she needed to sort something out with the sound team. He returned to the table, tried to start a conversation with a coworker of hers, but his head was far away. He looked around trying to find where she was, and when he finally saw her, she wasn't alone. I was with the same man as before. They were too close, laughing quietly, and he touched her waist with the naturalness of someone who had done this before. Ethan froze. He couldn't move for a few seconds. He watched her body lean slightly toward him, her hand resting on his chest with familiarity. The expression on their faces was not that of colleagues. It was too intimate. And there, in that fraction of time that stretched out like an eternity, something inside him silently collapsed. Clara returned to the table a few minutes later, composed, smiling, but now her eyes avoided his with more intensity. Ethan pretended to be normal. He toasted the others, smiled mechanically, but inside he was in free fall. He needed confirmation, proof, something that would take him out of that state between doubt and certainty. He got up and went to the bar. He ordered a double whiskey, took a deep breath, and with the glass in his hand he began to walk among the guests, as if looking for an answer in the midst of chaos. He stopped near the corridor that led backstage to the hall, and then he saw it. Clara and the man, in a more private corner, with their backs to him. She held his hand. They looked at each other. And before he could turn his back or react, he saw his hand touch her face, his thumb caressing the corner of her mouth, and then the kiss. Fast but loaded. A kiss that didn't apologize, didn't hide its intention. And she responded. Ethan felt his heart stop for a moment. The blood runs cold. The world spins around. The voices in the hall became a distant noise, the laughter a cruel trail. There were no more doubts. That was the scene that you never forget, the image that sticks in your bones, that invades your dreams, that destroys everything that was built. He stumbled back to the table, sat down without understanding who was around him, and drank the rest of the whiskey in one gulp. His eyes were dry, but inside he was stormy. He didn't say anything. He didn't react immediately. He just remained there, standing still, digesting the impossible, like someone who witnesses their own world being undone before their eyes, in silence. A few minutes later, Clara returned smiling, as if nothing had happened. He sat down next to Ethan, grabbed a glass and toasted his colleagues. He didn't look at him. She avoided him as if she knew she had been seen. But he still tried to maintain the pose, the theater. Ethan noticed. And decided. It wouldn't be there that I would confront him. It wouldn't be in particular that I would throw everything on the floor. Because what she destroyed in silence, he would reveal out loud. Not yet then, but very soon. She stood up calmly, straightened her jacket and left the room without saying anything. He went to the parking lot, took a deep breath and then called a number he had already saved days before, like someone preparing for a war they know is coming. His voice was firm. He just said it was time. He hung up and returned to the party, with another look, another rhythm in his walk, another weight on his chest. The music now seemed louder, the laughter more forced, the lights more blinding. Ethan moved among the guests like an actor rehearsing the last scene of an unforgettable show. The pain was still there, but now it was accompanied by something new. A type of lucidity that only arises after the shock. He looked at Clara from afar. She smiled. She danced. She pretended. But her time to pretend was running out. Because what Ethan prepared in the last few days was not just an impulsive reaction. It was a turning point. And what Clara didn't know, what no one there imagined, was that the party wouldn't end as it started. What Ethan would soon say, in front of everyone, would forever change the image of perfection she held. But this was still just the beginning. The clock was almost 11 at night when Ethan returned to the room, his face too serene for the confusion that hid behind his eyes. The party was already at its peak, with guests in excited circles, glasses raised, loud music and laughter spread everywhere. Clara, carefree, danced near the stage with some colleagues. Her ex-husband, recently reappeared at the event like a ghost that no one expected to see there, was a few meters away, talking to the company's directors, with an unpretentious charm that deeply irritated Ethan, but did not intimidate him. He walked straight up to the officiant and asked for the microphone. He didn't explain much, he just said he needed 5 minutes. Something in his tone, in his firm posture, made the man just nod and interrupt the music with a discreet signal to the DJ. The hall, little by little, fell into silence. The guests, curious, turned to the center where Ethan was already positioned. Clara stopped dancing, visibly confused, but didn't immediately show concern. The ex-husband, in turn, raised his chin with a crooked smile, as if he was already expecting some desperate reaction. But Ethan wasn't desperate. It was decided. And, with the microphone in hand, he began his speech with a calm that contrasted with the imminent chaos. He said that night was, in fact, a milestone. A celebration of cycles that come to an end and truths that, however painful, liberate. The tone of his voice made everyone in the room completely silent. There was no more music, no more clinking glasses, no more hurried footsteps. There was only his voice, increasingly firm, increasingly cold. And then, he looked directly at Clara and, without looking away, announced, "I know everything. Not just what happened just now. But what has been happening for weeks. I saw it. I heard it. And today, you will hear it too." Clara turned pale. His once confident stance crumbled within seconds. She tried to interrupt him, walking to the center of the room, but Ethan raised his hand with a firm gesture, and the security guard positioned at the side of the stage stepped forward, preventing her from interrupting him. The ex-husband, noticing the tension, tried to get closer, but stopped when he realized that something bigger was coming. Then Ethan revealed it. That he had discovered the affair. It had images, prints of messages, call records. That everything had been collected carefully, not to take revenge, but to understand how far the lie went. But that wasn't the most important thing. Because the real twist, the secret that everyone in that room was about to hear, was something else. Ethan then pointed to Clara's ex-husband, now with his hands in his pockets and a defiant look. He revealed, with precision, that same day, before the party started, he had concluded a negotiation that had been being built for months in secret. A discreet, silent, but devastating negotiation. He bought 40% of the company where his ex-husband worked. The man who now looked at him with derision would lose, that night, not only his morale, but also his job. Ethan explained that, as the majority shareholder of the subsidiary where this man was an executive, he had signed his resignation shortly before the event, effective immediately. He said this coldly, without raising the tone, without theatricality. The impact was not in the volume of the words, but in the weight they carried. The murmur among the guests was immediate. Some looked at each other without understanding. Others were laughing, surprised by what they were hearing. Clara's ex-husband finally lost his temper. He tried to laugh, but it was a dry, nervous laugh, like someone trying to hold on while everything falls apart. He said it was a bluff, that no one made that kind of decision at the last minute. But then Ethan took the signed contract out of his pocket, with the company logo, stamps and signatures. He handed it to one of the members present, who read it and confirmed it in a low voice. The ex-husband then started to walk towards Ethan, now visibly upset, but was stopped again by one of the security guards. Clara watched everything as if she were outside her own body. Hands shaking, eyes teary, knees ready to give way. Ethan looked back at her. There was pain in his eyes, but no more confusion. He knew what he was doing. And he wasn't there to humiliate her. He was there to free himself. He said it was never about revenge, but about justice. That what hurt most wasn't the kiss, it wasn't the lies, it was the choice. The choice she made to hide, to plan, to live something so intimate with another man while sharing the bed and the days with him. The choice to lie with her eyes even when she said she loved him. He said he didn't deserve to be betrayed in silence, after everything they had built together. But now there would be no more silence. Said she was free. Free to be with whoever he wanted, but he was also free from her. Clara tried to speak. He tried to say that it wasn't quite like that. That I didn't want everything to end like that. That she still loved him. But Ethan interrupted her. He said that love is not proven after it is destroyed. Love shows itself in small details, in difficult decisions, in silent loyalties. And that, for him, the love he felt for her died the moment he saw that she was capable of pretending for so long. The silence in the hall was sepulchral. Everyone was in shock, many visibly embarrassed, others gaping. Clara's ex-husband had already left the place, humiliated, defeated, trying to process what had happened. And then Ethan, still on stage, thanked him. He said this was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. That there was no more room for mistakes. And, before leaving, he looked at Clara one last time. His gaze was firm, but carried a deep sadness. Like someone looking at a past that was beautiful, but now it only hurts. He got off the stage, handed over the microphone and walked towards the exit with slow but determined steps. He didn't look back. Clara fell into the nearest chair, without strength. Everyone walked away, leaving her alone in the center of a party that no longer made sense. And at the back of the room, a new chapter was already being drawn, although no one knew it yet. Because what Clara and everyone else ignored was that there was something more, something not yet revealed. Something that would make that night even more unforgettable. The rain started fine when Ethan left the room, as if the sky decided to wash away everything that had been said with a cold and cruel delicacy. He didn't run. He walked to the car with calculated slowness, as if he needed his body to keep pace with what his soul was still trying to assimilate. Inside the vehicle, he started the engine, but did not leave immediately. He stood there, watching the rearview mirror as if he expected Clara to appear behind him, running, screaming for a second chance. But the door remained closed, the hallway empty, the silence of the parking lot only interrupted by the noise of the tires on the wet street. The night seemed to have swallowed all sounds. And it was in this silence that he finally cried. Not a desperate or hysterical cry, but a contained, dense lament, like that of someone crying not for loss, but for the illusion that had to be forcibly ripped away. The kind of crying that doesn't come through the eyes, but through the throat. A knot impossible to untie. And yet, he didn't come back. Not at that moment. Clara sat in the empty hall for over an hour after everyone left. Some tables still had half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, souvenirs of a party that had ended in ruins. Nobody said goodbye to her. Nobody consoled her. The few people who remained limited themselves to looks of pity or judgment. The weight of public exposure paralyzed her. Shame burned hotter than anger. But there was also something worse, his absence. Because until then, even amidst the lies, Ethan was still a safe haven. A refuge. A man who made her feel loved even when she no longer knew how to reciprocate. And now, she was just an echo of the woman he had decided to forget. She got up with difficulty, her feet hurting from the heels, her makeup smeared, and left the room carrying her own failure on her shoulders. The driver was waiting for her in the car. She entered silently and did not say the address. He just asked me to drive. I didn't know where to go. I didn't want to go home. Meanwhile, Ethan drove aimlessly, his eyes fixed on the road and his mind in a whirl. The city, lit by the orange lamps on the streetlights and reflected in the wet glass, seemed more distant than ever. He didn't want to go back to the home they shared. The place where every piece of furniture now carried the weight of a lie. I needed air. Of space. He remembered a discreet downtown hotel where he had once stayed during a home renovation. He stopped in front of reception without a suitcase, without a plan. He asked for a room in a dry voice, handed over the card and went upstairs with heavy steps. Upon entering, he took off his wet jacket, loosened his tie and threw himself into the armchair. The silence in the room was suffocating. But unlike the party room, there the silence was his. For the first time in months, he was alone with himself. And that wasn't a punishment, it was relief. The next morning, the cell phone vibrated non-stop. Missed calls, long messages from Clara, attempts to contact his sister, mutual friends, even his own lawyer. He ignored them all. He left early, had coffee at a random bakery and decided that, before taking any definitive steps, he needed to meet someone. Someone who, until then, had been just a name on contracts, in silent meetings with lawyers. Someone who, without knowing it, had just had his life changed by the decisions of that night. With her diary in hand, she called a number and got straight to the point. She wanted to schedule a meeting with one of the directors at the headquarters of Clara's ex-husband's company. It wasn't about the position, nor the future of the company. It was about ending, once and for all, any link between the three. When he was served, he asked not to involve intermediaries, and he was respected. The meeting would take place that same afternoon. Meanwhile, Clara remained in her best friend's apartment, where she had spent the morning in silence. When he finally spoke, he didn't cry. She was strangely calm. As if he already knew that what had been broken couldn't be fixed. The friend tried to console, tried to argue, but she just said she needed to talk to Ethan. Not to win back, not to beg. But to look into his eyes one last time. The friend insisted that this would only cause more pain, but Clara did not give in. He got in the car at noon, heading to the company where he had worked for years. I wanted to know if he had been there. Maybe someone knew where he had gone. When she arrived at reception, she was surprised by the information that Ethan had resigned that morning, formally and without explanation. The news hit her like a punch. He didn't just want distance. He wanted to disappear from the life they shared. That made her hesitate. The employee said he had left a sealed envelope with Clara's name, instructing it to be delivered if she showed up. She took the envelope with shaking hands, climbed into the car and opened it right there, in the driver's seat. Inside, there was a single sheet. A handwritten note, in his handwriting, firm but tired. Nothing you say now will change what I saw. And nothing I say will erase what you did. But I choose to carry on. No hate, no revenge, just without you. Clara cried for the first time since the night before. He cried like someone who understands that he lost something that he will never get back. It wasn't the end of a marriage. It was the end of a story in which she had been truly loved, perhaps for the last time. He threw his head against the steering wheel and remained there, silent, while the city traffic continued indifferent to his pain. At the company's headquarters, Ethan was completing the last stage of the transition as a new shareholder. His presence there, now coated with authority, left everyone disconcerted. But he was polite, direct, objective. He delivered documents, signed papers, and at the end of the meeting, asked to speak alone with the CEO. When they were alone, he explained that he was not just there to command, but to end cycles. He asked that the dismissal of Clara's ex-husband be conducted with dignity, without scandals, but with clarity. I don't want to harm anyone, but I also don't want to share space with him in any sector that has my signature, he said. The CEO nodded in agreement. There was nothing to discuss. On the way out, Ethan met a woman in the hallway. She was the new director of human resources. He exchanged few words with her, but something in her gaze made him stop. It was a calm but penetrating gaze. Like someone who recognizes pain without asking about it. She called him by name, said she had read about him in the merger reports. Ethan smiled slightly, thanked him, and headed to the elevator. But that look stayed with him. In the following days, Clara tried to contact us a few more times. He called, sent short messages, but never begged. It was as if I knew I had no more space. He was just trying to preserve something he didn't even know how to name. A shred of dignity, perhaps. Ethan, in turn, began to redesign his days. He looked for a new apartment, handed over the keys to his old house to the real estate agent, and donated objects he no longer wanted. There was no rush, but there was purpose. I wanted to start over. And starting over, for him, meant leaving behind everything that reminded him of Clara. Not with spite. But with lucidity. It was on an unexpected afternoon, when leaving a cafe, that he again saw the HR director of the company where he had ended the cycle. She recognized him from afar, waved, and this time he came closer. They talked for a few minutes, exchanging banal impressions about the weather and the neighborhood. He discovered that her name was Elena, that she loved reading detective novels, and that she had 2 cats named after Greek philosophers. They laughed. Ethan realized he didn't feel tense. I didn't feel afraid. It was just light. And that, for him, was rarer than passion. It was freedom. On the same day, Clara received a letter. It was from Ethan's mother. The woman, with whom she had a cordial relationship, wrote with sadness. She said Ethan's pain was deeper than she could imagine. That he was trying to get himself together. And that perhaps, in the future, he could forgive her. But now, he needed peace. Clara read the letter several times. She kept it in her bedside table drawer and, that night, she slept alone for the first time without hope. Just with the weight of what he had done. Ethan, at that same moment, was having dinner with Elena in a discreet restaurant. They didn't talk about the past, nor about wounds. They talked about wine, about books, about places in the world they would like to visit. He laughed. In truth. For the first time in months, I laughed with my chest open. And while she told a funny story about a trip she had taken to Spain, he looked at her calmly and thought that maybe, just maybe, there was life after the end. I just needed to be brave enough to live this life. What Clara didn't know, and perhaps would never know, is that the real punishment wasn't losing the man who loved her. It was knowing that he managed to move on without her. While she was still holding on to memories that would never return. And that was final. The morning after dinner with Elena dawned without fanfare, without tension, without any of the heaviness that had usually accompanied Ethan's awakenings in recent weeks. He opened his eyes slowly, without rushing, smelling the coffee coming from the kitchen of the new apartment that he had barely started to live in, but which already had an air of promising beginnings. It was a smaller, more compact place, without the large windows of the old house, but it had the silence necessary to start over. The boxes were still on the floor, the pictures were leaning against the walls, but the mess of the space didn't bother him. It was, in a way, an external representation of what he himself lived inside, a new construction where he was still searching for where everything should be. On the kitchen table, among papers and magazines, rested the final contract for the business transition. Next to him, a ceramic mug with the phrase, "Some losses are liberations in disguise," which Ethan had bought more out of irony than faith, but which was beginning to make a strange sense. While preparing coffee, I thought about the latest events like someone revisiting a dream too dense to be real. The image of Clara being publicly confronted still came in flashes, not with pride, but with a coldness that he didn't know he was capable of sustaining. There were moments when he questioned whether he had gone too far, whether exposure was necessary, whether the path of justice had not crossed the line of revenge. But then he remembered how he felt seeing her, in the arms of another, inside a story that he helped build with everything he had. And he understood. I understood that some limits cannot be ignored, that there are decisions that are taken away from us by the brutality of the facts. It wasn't about rematch, it was about clarity. In response to the contempt with which she threw away everything they once swore to preserve. At the company, backstage was buzzing with the developments of what had happened at the party. Although Clara's ex-husband's termination was handled professionally, there was no way to stop the rumors from spreading. The more discreet commented in the corridors, others limited themselves to awkward silences at any mention of Ethan's name. Clara, now isolated in her own position, felt the weight of each look. It wasn't just the betrayal that condemned her in the eyes of her colleagues, but the fact that she had involved the name of an influential man in a scandal that spilled over into her personal life. Decisions that were previously made by her autonomously began to be reviewed, trust evaporating in subtle doses, like smoke in a closed environment. Clara started arriving earlier and leaving later, like someone trying, through excessive effort, to regain a respect that can no longer be earned with professional delivery. And it was at this exhausted pace that she began to wonder if the choice for that parallel relationship had, in fact, been driven by love or just by a desperate search for something that she herself could not name. Conversations with her friend became more sparse. Clara avoided talking about Ethan, and when the name came up, it was always with a subsequent silence filled with regret. He tried, for a few days, to believe that there was a way to fix it, to sew together the remaining pieces, but he soon understood that the damage was irreversible. Ethan didn't block her, but he wasn't responding either. He had decided to follow, and she, deep down, knew that any attempt to get closer would sound selfish. Yet, one lonely night, he wrote a letter. Not to send. Just to get rid of what still weighed inside. In the letter, she didn't apologize, she didn't justify herself, she just described what she felt. The feeling of having been swallowed by a hole she dug herself, of looking back and seeing the exact moment she turned her back on what really mattered. He kept the letter in a drawer and couldn't explain why he did it. Maybe, one day, I would want to reread and remember who I didn't want to be again. On the other side of the city, Ethan's routine began to pick up pace. Meetings with Elena became more frequent. There were no promises, no rush, just a light coexistence, with conversations that began with trivialities and ended in comfortable silences. Ethan felt alive. Not in the intense sense of the beginning of a romance, but in a stable way, like someone who finally finds solid ground after a long time adrift. On a random Saturday, they went to a bookstore together. He watched her as she chose books with the concentration of someone who believes that words are still capable of healing. And, without realizing it, he smiled. He realized that he was relearning to admire. Looking at someone without fear of being deceived. Elena didn't ask questions about the past. I just listened when he wanted to talk. And that, for him, was new. It was during one of these meetings that she asked him a simple question, but one that touched him profoundly. Sitting in a small cafe, she looked him in the eye and asked, "Have you forgiven yourself?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Ethan looked away, stirred his coffee, tried to smile, but didn't respond immediately. He realized he didn't know. He had distanced himself, he had rebuilt himself, but forgiveness was still not certain. Because part of him still carried the guilt of not having seen it before, of having trusted too much, of having remained silent when the signs were before his eyes. He realized that, despite all the external movement, something inside him still needed to be pacified. That night, after dropping Elena off at home, Ethan drove to the old residence, where a new family now lived. He stopped the car on the other side of the street and stayed there for a few minutes. The lights were on, there were toys in the yard, voices were coming from the kitchen. It was no longer his home. It was another story. Another narrative being written in the same scenario where his ended. And it was there, at that moment, that he understood that forgiving himself was not about forgetting what he suffered, but accepting that he did the best he could with what he knew at the time. And now, knowing more hurt, but freed. In the days that followed, Clara was called by the board to discuss her position in the company. She was not fired, but she received a clear proposal to change sector, to a less visible area, without major responsibilities, a kind of disguised exile. He accepted without question. It was no longer out of pride, but out of conscience. I knew the cycle had closed there too. The woman who was once celebrated for her results now needed to relearn how to be useful without the spotlight. And it was in this process that Clara began to face something she avoided, the emptiness that remained after Ethan left. An emptiness that wasn't about physical presence, but about the absence of something no other man seemed to offer, true trust. On a rainy late afternoon, Clara decided to visit Ethan's mother. He didn't know what he was looking for, maybe a kind of symbolic forgiveness, or just a place where he could remember what he lost. His mother received her with surprise, but without aggression. They talked for hours. She told stories about Ethan as a child, talked about how much he had suffered in silence, and said, with a firm look, that Clara should learn from that. He said that betrayals are sometimes more about who cheats than about who is betrayed. And that, one day, when Clara had the courage to look at herself without excuses, she would understand the real reason why everything had fallen apart. When leaving that house, Clara did not cry. He walked to the car with slow steps, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that he had understood something that the pain had not allowed him to see before. She was not the victim of circumstances. She was the author of her own downfall. And now, I had to learn how to write a new story with the letters that were left. On the other side of town, Ethan was following. Not in a hurry, not under pressure. Just following. And, even without knowing it, he was approaching an ending that still had something to reveal. Because certain stories, even when they seem closed, have one last twist. One last gesture. One last reunion. That it would come, but not in the way expected. It was months later, on an ordinary spring afternoon, that Ethan and Clara's paths crossed one last time. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic. It was in a bookstore, one of those small ones, with the smell of old paper and natural light streaming through the windows. He was with Elena, idly looking at a shelf of biographies, when he heard the familiar sound of careful footsteps behind him. He turned slowly, and there was Clara. Alone, dressed simply, without makeup, hair tied up in any way. Her eyes met his with the same intensity as when they first met, but now there was an absence there, a silent understanding that nothing would be recovered. Elena noticed the tension, but remained. Clara approached, said just a hello, almost in a whisper, and extended her hand to shake him. Ethan accepted, firmly but briefly. Her hand was shaking. Elena watched them with empathy, without intervention. Clara then looked at Elena and smiled with an almost resigned air, as if she understood, without needing to ask, that she arrived too late. Ethan, out of respect, introduced the two. It was quick, civilized, with no open wounds on display. And before leaving, Clara just said, "I hope you're happy." Ethan didn't respond. Just waved. And she understood. There was no more resentment, no more affection, just the end. A mature, cold, inevitable end. After that meeting, Clara didn't try to make contact anymore. He plunged into a new cycle of life, more introspective, quieter. She resigned from the company after being relocated to an irrelevant sector. He used his savings to open a small graphic design studio, something that had always been a dormant passion. He didn't get rich, but he found a kind of peace he never sought while feeding on praise and power. He started going to therapy, not to try to understand what he lost, but to try to understand who he was when he made everything fall apart. He discovered old wounds, needs disguised as independence, traits of selfishness masked as self-affirmation. Little by little, he began to forgive himself. But the hardest thing was accepting that Ethan's forgiveness might never come. And that's okay. Because sometimes, living with the consequence of a choice is the only way to evolve. He aged a little in these months. Not in the face, but in the eyes. He learned not to romanticize mistakes and not to seek redemption from others. But, even with this maturity, there were days when I slept hugging memories, whispering apologies that would never be heard. I knew there would be other stories, other beginnings, but none with the weight and truth that I had felt next to him. And that was his punishment. Not loneliness. But the constant reminder of what he lost because he didn't know how to value it. Ethan, on the other hand, continued building the new phase of his life with the calm of someone who has already faced too many storms. The relationship with Elena evolved slowly, with respect and listening. It wasn't intense, but it was solid. She understood his silences, respected his pauses, didn't demand what didn't yet exist. And for that very reason, something new began to blossom there. Not a love that explodes, but a love that grows slowly, like roots that deepen before sprouting. He started working as an independent consultant, choosing the projects he wanted and rejecting the ones that didn't make sense. He discovered pleasure in small rituals, reading for breakfast, walking aimlessly, cooking simple dishes. One day, during one of these walks, he came across a boy trying to fix a bicycle. He helped without saying his name. And when the boy thanked him with a smile, Ethan felt a kind of reconciliation with life. As if he had finally found a version of himself that did not depend on anyone, not on the past, not on glories, not on tests. It was just him. Whole, remade, sufficient. Clara's ex-husband, in turn, did not suffer the same fate. After his dismissal, he tried to sue the company, but without evidence, he was discredited. It lost credibility in the market, and the doors gradually closed. He moved to another city, tried to open his own business, but the arrogance that previously made him seductive now isolated him. He never looked for Clara again. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of convenience. The silence between them was the only agreement they had as a former couple. He became a lonely, suspicious man, obsessed with the idea that everything he lost was the fault of others. But deep down, in moments of lucidity that appeared in the early hours of the morning, he knew that he had become a prisoner of his own choices. And as he looked at his increasingly tired reflection in the mirror, he sometimes whispered her name bitterly, not out of longing, but out of regret for not leaving her in the past when he had the chance. Elena and Ethan decided to move in together just over a year after the scandal. It was a thoughtful, calm, non-urgent decision. She was not the opposite of Clara. He was just someone who knew how to embrace what was broken without wanting to put it back together in a hurry. Together, they created a home where silence was not burden but comfort. A place where you didn't have to explain what already hurt, because there was space for time to heal. On a rainy night, similar to the one at the party that marked his life, Ethan invited her on a trip. Not a tourist itinerary, but a journey along the road, with no specific destination. Just the two of them, low music, long conversations and new places to discover. And it was on this trip that he finally understood that loving again was not betraying the old pain. It was proof that he survived it. Clara found out about their union from a mutual friend. He didn't cry, he didn't rebel. He just smiled, with his eyes downcast, and replied, it was what he deserved. And, for the first time, that sentence didn't carry sadness. Just recognition. That night, she returned home, lit a scented candle and reopened the notebook where she wrote her texts. Not to publish, but to remind yourself of who you wanted to be. He wrote about loss, about guilt, but also about new beginnings. And there, between one line and another, he understood that some people are not destined to remain, but to teach. And that, perhaps, Ethan had been the greatest teacher of his life. Not by his words, but by his exit. Life then went on. No big twists. No return. Only with the marks left by the paths that each one chose to follow. Ethan became an example of resilience for those who knew him, Clara became a symbol of discreet overcoming for those who followed her from afar. But within them, the lived history continued to be present, not as a trauma, but as a tattoo, invisible at first sight, but impossible to erase completely. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. Would you have done it differently? What surprised you most about this plot? I really want to know your opinion. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive the next stories. Every week, new impactful plots, with real and exciting twists, await you here. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our mission is to show, through fiction, how infidelity can destroy lives, relationships and futures. Thanks for listening to the end. Until the next story.